I am excited to introduce our final plenary speaker and the respondent for today. Martin Rodriguez is an associate professor of practical theology and missiology at Azusa Pacific University, where he teaches courses on mission, leadership, and spiritual formation. Raised on the mission field in Puebla, Mexico, and later serving as a missionary in East Asia, Martin's life has been shaped by the tensions and gifts of border-crossing faith. A graduate of Fuller Seminary's PhD in Intercultural Studies, his work explores how communities discern God's activity together, usually in the messy middle of culture, theology, relationships, and real life. His current research explores borderland missiology, appreciative inquiry, and the role of the Holy Spirit in intercultural learning communities. He is preparing his dissertation, Borderland Church, Relational Pathways for Cultivating Missional Discernment in Multicultural Ministry, for publication, while also co-authoring The Praxis of Practical Theology with Mark Laubranson and Testimonios, Narrative, Agency, and Theology in Hispanic Churches with Juan F. Martinez. He also hosts the Missiology podcast, a mix of thoughtful interviews and his own musings on mission, church, leadership, and the occasional identity crisis. His words, not mine. Martin lives in Altadena, California with his wife Erin and their 3 kids, who daily remind him that God's mission is often less about strategy and more about improvisation, bedtime stories, and wonder. Man after my own heart. Responding to Dr. Rodriguez is our very own Dr. Collin Cornell. He will be joining us remotely via Zoom on that screen over there from his state of Texas, where he teaches at Fuller's Houston campus. He joined the Fuller faculty in 2023 as assistant professor of Bible and Mission. Dually appointed to the Bible department and the missiology department, he teaches classes in Old Testament and missiology, particularly biblical theology of mission. His research interests center on the history of religions and biblical theology, and he publishes on a range of related topics, including Psalms, tabernacle texts, Levantine religious traditions, post-supersessionist hermeneutics, and ecological interpretation. Prior to Fuller, Dr. Cornell taught as visiting faculty at the University of the South, Sewanee, Duke Divinity School, and Candler School of Theology at Emory University. And as in the previous sessions, after hearing from our respondent, Drs. Rodriguez and Cornell will take questions. Be sure to submit your questions, as you already know, using Whova's Q&A feature for all participants in person and online. We will try to answer as many as time allows. Dr. Rodriguez.
Muchas gracias. Saludos a todos. Over the past few years, I've had the surreal privilege of sitting down with my missiological heroes and people whose books I used to underline in seminary, I now get to interrupt on a podcast. When Greg McKenzie and I began the Missiology podcast, our goal wasn't to transform, innovate the discipline, or even get good audio. We simply wanted to sit down with women, with men who had shaped our own missiological imagination. And what started as a couple of microphones and shared curiosity became, is that perfect? Let's go to the next one. Thank you. Became a living archive, an ethnography of the ethnographers, if you want to put it that way, a scholography, because once you have a PhD, apparently you can start inventing words. None of this would exist, of course, without those interviewees, the guests who came onto the podcast, who trusted us with their time and their stories. Names like Stephen Bevins, Wilbert Schenck, Charles Kraft, Eddie Gibbs, Sherwood Lingenfelter, Miriam Adeney, Galen Van Reenen, Ruth Padilla de Borst, Christine Kim, Amos Young, Scott Sundquist, Johnny Ramirez Johnson, the list goes on. I just want to say thank you. You lent us your words, your wounds, and your wisdom and wonder. To Mark Branson, this podcast really grew from questions that you taught me to ask. Thank you. To the Missio Dei Journal and missiology.com team, Chris Flanders, Amanda Pittman, Yukikazu Obata and Paul Chimhungwe and John Barton, thank you for your trust and creativity to try something new. And of course, to Greg McKenzie, one of the great missiological minds, I believe, of our generation. And more importantly, my friend, you somehow made all of this a lot more fun. We framed all of these interviews that we did on this podcast, we framed them around 5 central questions. Tell me about your high points. Tell me about what your key influences were. Tell me when you noticed God at work in your life. What have you contributed to the field? And what do you still hope for? They sound like questions that are pretty easy to answer until you try to answer them without drifting into a sermon. We weren't hunting for abstractions. We were listening for stories. The heart of the project is about stories. Methodologically, at the heart of this project is appreciative inquiry, a qualitative action research method, and more. It's really more deeply a way of seeing. And it starts with the art of asking better questions, life-giving questions that open new possibilities. Not trick questions, just the kind of questions that make people tilt their heads and say, no one's ever asked me that before. David Cooperrider, who first gave voice to this approach, insisted that human systems are not machines to be fixed or problems that we can hammer until they behave. They are living webs of meaning, humming with stories and connections. And so instead of tinkering with what's broken, David Cooperrider asked that we listen for what's already breathing, what's already alive. Appreciative inquiry is not optimism in research clothes, it's disciplined hope. The steady courage to look for what's working, to name what's good, and to carry those stories forward as the seeds for the future. Which, for academics, is actually a lot harder than it sounds because we're trained professionally to locate problems. But our courage when it comes to appreciative inquiry immediately confronts a question. And the question is this: can appreciation really be the right posture for a time like this within missiology, within our field of study? Because in missiology, we are, especially here in the West, particularly here in the West, we are living and teaching amid profound disruptions. Christian higher education in North America is being shaken, schools are closing or merging, enrollments are collapsing, finances are fraying, donors are retreating, culture wars are bleeding into classrooms, and digital competitors are promising formation in 15-minute videos. Leaders and students alike are asking questions like, will this be standing in 5 years? Will my job still exist? Will this degree mean something, anything, in 5 years besides debt? In such a moment, naming strengths can feel almost indecent, like putting rose-colored glasses on while the curtains are catching fire. And yet, history whispers a different story. Crisis is often the soil where new life takes root. Organizational scholar Edgar Schein said that institutions are formed in crucibles of adaptation and integration, which is an academic way of saying that we change when the floor drops out from under us, when the things that once held us no longer can. It's our moment in many ways when it comes to missiology. Appreciative inquiry is like asking a room full of exhausted people, what's still alive here? And then watching as that question, the question itself, breathes life back into the room. Why do we dare to hope? Why do we have this stubborn confidence that there's still life? Because for us, as missiologists, hope is not optimism. Hope is theology. It's the confidence, not in our own cleverness or in the strength of the human spirit or in our MacGyver-like capacity to duct tape things back together. It's trust. Trust that the same Spirit who hovered over chaos in Genesis chapter 1 hovers still over our collapsing structures, over our anxious institutions, over our own weary hearts. What we're doing here is a little bit different than a typical appreciative inquiry because, in one sense, you might call it an appreciative missiological inquiry. It's appreciative inquiry with a theological heartbeat. For us, this is not about escapism, right? It's about wakefulness. The posture that Paul the Apostle called for in Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, when Paul said to fix our minds, and he commends the church and to fix our minds on the things that are pure and honorable and just and pure and commendable. Human agency lives in the pause, the breath between what strikes us and how we respond. And in that borderland space, we choose where to lean. We choose which story we are going to inhabit. And we, as missiologists, choose this story. The Spirit of the living God is renewing all things. And our task is to wake up and walk in step. The Missio Dei is not undone by uncertainty or loss or institutional contraction because the Spirit of God is making all things new. Even now, especially now. So this paper is growing out of this thematic analysis of these 26 podcast interviews and just as many post-game interviews, which I coded and I treated as if it were qualitative data to discern patterns and postures and practices shaping missiology for a new generation. There were many life-giving themes that emerged from my analysis, but I've chosen to share 4 with you today. And while the study really, you heard the names that I read a second ago, the study included voices from across traditions, but I'm focusing here on stories from Fuller graduates, from Fuller faculty, voices whose lives and words embody these themes. And as you hear these themes, as I talk you through these themes, I hope that you'll receive them in the spirit that they were intended, not as answers, but as openings, as an invitation to join a conversation and discern what is worth carrying into the future. Across the interview, one theme surfaced again and again. The theme that God is the primary agent of mission. The one who runs the show. For many of our guests, David Bosch's Transforming Mission was where the story began in some ways. They can trace, for many people, they trace their theological imagination back to its pages because Bosch gave us, in some sense, a coherence to our field and opened doors of respect among other theologians and offered a language for the Missio Dei that has since infused so many other branches of theology. Even so, Transforming Mission is less a monument than a milestone. The terrain continues to shift, and so, as Kirstine Kim puts it in her interview, we've been rewriting Bosch ever since, pressing beyond his Western frame toward theologies of the Spirit, feminist and ecological perspectives, and contexts that Bosch could perhaps only glimpse. And maybe that is who missiologists are at heart, people still rewriting Bosch. And our calling, as Dr. Kim puts in her interview, is to hold the different discourses together, theology, social sciences, history, and practice, and to keep the conversation going. All that weaving of voices, it circles back again and again to the heart of the field, which is this, that learning to recognize and join the Spirit's work in the world. And yet, tucked inside these interviews, one also hears a soft lament, and it's not always explicit, but it's easy to catch when you're listening for it. a sense that in every generation, the impulse toward strategy, toward managerialism, and measurable results can drown out the heart of mission. Our history reminds us how easily God's work becomes tangled with our own ambitions for growth or institutional survival, with our own restless need to succeed, to prove that our plans are working, our strategies are effective. But missiology at its best insists that the Spirit, not the strategist, runs the show. When Eddie Gibbs, professor emeritus of church growth, passed away on February 27th this year at the age of 86, the missiological community lost a voice marked by honesty, humility, and deep love for the church. His interview opens with really disarming candor. He says, "I came to missiology through pain and failure. Sent to Chile without a day of missionary training, he stumbled through cultural misunderstandings. And at one point, he describes how he's baffled by the phrase, ojo malo, the evil eye, because he had no framework to interpret an animistic worldview. His zeal was very real, but it wasn't enough. Those early mistakes left scars on him, he describes, and on those he had gone to serve. His pain became the beginning, however, of discernment, a discovery that mission is not technique, but trust, not management, but relationship and openness to the Spirit already at work. And over time, that insight hardened into a conviction that he shared with us on the podcast, that churches do not die because they fail to adapt to culture. They die because they fail to adapt to the Spirit doing a new thing." Scott Sundquist, who became Dean of the School of Intercultural Studies in 2012, tells a story that makes God's agency hard to miss. Sam Moffat's father, called the walking up the road man, because he went everywhere on foot, came one day to a village in northern Korea. That very same morning, the local shaman had told the people, "A man from God will come today and show us how to know him." So Moffat arrives and said, "I'm that man." He preaches Jesus and the whole village is converted. He hadn't brought God. God was already there. And for Sundquist, he describes in his podcast how this story became a lens for reading history itself. History as tracing the Spirit's quiet, unmistakable work in the world. Even events that are marked by pain and displacement, like mass migration or the scattering of the diaspora of peoples, can bear witness to grace, God already moving ahead, faith crossing borders for those of us who have eyes, for those of us who are watching. That, I believe, is missiology at its best, learning to notice where the Spirit has already gone before us. For 6 decades, contextualization has been arguably the defining task of missiology. How the gospel takes root, studying how the gospel takes root in every culture without losing its integrity. From Hebert to Bevins to Schreider, we've learned so much. And yet, too often, I think these kinds of conversations have been carried on as though the task were simply cultural translation, moving the gospel from one container to another without much reference to God's presence and activity in the world. Shaped as I am by Latinx experiences of hybridity and borderlands, I worry that contextualization sometimes becomes managing culture instead of discerning the Spirit. Contextualization remains vital, but for a new generation, it must find its home inside something much larger and riskier, the ongoing communal discernment of the Spirit's disruptive work. Dr. Kim calls this a third movement in mission theology. Beyond speaking of the Father and the Son, we must ask, what does it mean to be sent by the Spirit? In the Spirit, through the power of the Spirit. Without that Trinitarian and pneumatological accent, she warns that mission collapses into technique and control. If the Spirit sends and empowers, then discernment is not an appendix to mission. It is the first act of it. We of all people know how easily our cultures can remake God in our image, and that's why discernment must be shared and tested and embodied and corrected in community. Dr. Kim and Dr. Young, in their podcast interviews, in their own way, emphasize that discernment must be intercultural. The Spirit speaks through others, across cultures, across boundaries, across differences. And that's not a problem to solve, it's a gift to receive. And that brings us to our second major theme, which is the theme of polyphony. Missiology cannot be monologue. Across the interviews, this theme emerged again and again, the Spirit's work through difference. And sometimes it's messy and disruptive. Dr. Timothy Park went to the Philippines, he describes, with training and resources and confidence. He planted churches, and in his own words, he says, "I became a boss." With missionary funds, he hired pastors. He created what he later recognized as a patron-client relationship with the local churches. The churches that he started were weak, he noticed, and dependent, where he watched Filipino-planted churches without foreign support grow, dynamic, and reproducible. After time at Fuller studying here, Parks says he returned with much repentance, and he tells the pastors, no more salaries. Of course, they're furious, and a lot of them threatened to split off completely. And yet, only by ending that system could genuine dignity and ownership emerge. Dependence had silenced their voice, and repentance meant refusing to keep the peace of false harmony. Polyphony here, in polyphony as I'm describing it, it's not neat harmony, but faithful dissonance. Sometimes it requires counterintuitive moves that honor the agency of the other. Park's story reminds us that repentance is more than listening politely. It may mean disrupting culture structures that mute local voices. Here's one of the uncomfortable observations. Dr. Park's interviews is one of my favorite of the interviews. It's full of vulnerability and hard-won wisdom. Yet Greg and I worried it might not attract as many listens as some of the headline guests. Why? Because Park's story it's not because it's less profound, but because of his accent. For many Westerners, non-native English requires effort to hear. And yet, that is precisely the invitation, the challenge of polyphony, to slow down, to lean in, and receive accented English as a gift, not a barrier. Accents are sometimes only the beginning. The other's voice can do more than sound strange or difficult to hear. It can sometimes unsettle our confidence, question our story, and even call us to be silent. Amos Young, in his podcast, describes how, at the time he was the director of Fuller's Center for Missiological Research, Dr. Young was shaped by a Pentecostal tradition, where mission stories often carried heroic tones. In his interview, he tells of how he entered missiology through the back door by listening to native critiques of Christian mission. At Regent University, just miles away from colonial Jamestown, he helped organize a conference that became a book, Remembering Jamestown, and the subtitle is Hard Questions About Christian Mission. For a Pentecostal, he describes it was a bracing experience. It was a bracing place to begin, confronting genocide and the doctrine of discovery and the dark side of mission in North America. There, Dr. Young met native theologians such as George Tink Tinker, who called for a moratorium on Christian mission to native peoples, and Richard Twiss, an evangelical native leader, sometimes mistrusted even by his own community. Their conversations exposed the depth of critique and the fragile hope of renewal. And Young admits that it was painful to stay in those places, in those spaces, but he stayed. There was one moment in particular that marked him. Barbara Ellisman, a native historian, not a Christian, stood up at the conference and read her essay. For Young, her presence became a parable. Those once treated as objects of mission were now the ones testifying. And later he would write that mutual witness means not only bearing witness to Christ, but attending to the witness of others and letting that back and forth reshape how we witness. And Young presses the point, and he does this through his books and his writings as well. Mission is not just hosting others in our theological house. It's becoming guests and theirs, sitting at their tables, eating their food, letting their questions change us. Listening to unsettling voices, he reminds us, is not relativism, it's humility. The Spirit speaking through those who expose our blind spots. Polyphony, then, it's not a Western gift, but a corrective sometimes to Western deafness. The Spirit's work through the many who insist on being heard, inviting us to remain in the dissonance long enough for it to shape us. Scott Sundquist, he recalls his years in Singapore as a kind of conversion in his podcast. The audacity, he says, of this white guy from Philadelphia teaching Asian church history. He laughs. His students could quote, and he also laments because his students could quote Wesley and Luther and Calvin, he remembers. Their shelves sagged under Western tomes. But when he mentioned John Sung, the Chinese evangelist who actually preached in Singapore, they shrugged, and they're like, well, there's nothing to read. Western history filled their libraries, and Asian Christianity was invisible. So out of that silence, out of the ripe old age of 33, he says, Sundquist began the Dictionary of Asian Christianity. And for 11 years, he traveled across 14 countries, gathering historians from every stream, Nazarenes and Adventists and Catholics and Presbyterians, Pentecostals, and articles arrived in 10 different languages, each one needing translation, each one needing discernment and trust. For some reason, he says, I was smart enough, probably because of my training under Sam Moffat, to let local people tell their own stories. And it was rarely simple. In Korea, for instance, the Presbyterians he describes refused to sit down with other Presbyterians, much less Catholics, and so he met with them one by one. In India, by contrast, everyone came together and no one stopped talking, he says. He remembers standing at the chalkboard at one point, frustrated that only one word had been agreed upon. And an Indian colleague stepped forward, took the chalk, and circled the board and said quietly, we've already agreed on 6. The outsider had missed what insiders knew and saw as consensus. And that moment stayed with him, he describes, and shaped his missiology. Polyphony means yielding control, not only of the story and the content, but sometimes of the very process itself, handing over the chalk. Collaboration is the identity of missiology itself. So Park releases control, Young listens through dissonance, Sundquist hands over the chalk. Polyphony is rarely a choir that's in tune with one another. It's more like jazz in tension. Voices sometimes clashing and pausing or improvising their way through, their way to grace. In the friction, the Spirit composes what no single line could score alone. For a new generation, the work ahead is not mastering harmony, but learning to stay in the song long enough to discern it. If polyphony means listening across difference, then this next movement asks the harder question. What happens when those differences wound? Power and pain surfaced everywhere in the interviews. Stories of failure and complicity. And the Spirit's slow work of refinement. Mission, after all, has never been a neutral exchange. The theme of confession of formation echoed through many of the interviews, but nowhere perhaps more profoundly than in my conversation with Dr. Wilbert Schenck, senior professor of mission history and contemporary culture, who recorded his interview with me just weeks before his passing in 2021. The quiet Mennonite historian who had spent decades tracing the tangled legacy of Western missions spoke not with nostalgia, but honesty and with repentance. For generations, Western Christians imagined that mission happened out there, while over here we simply did evangelism, a fiction built on the illusion that Western theology was culture-free. The Spirit and universal. The Spirit, through global partners, keeps unmasking that conceit. But Schenck said it plainly. The West itself is a mission field. Consistently, that was one of his messages. The same Spirit who sends also searches, exposes our own nationalism and racism and self-assured theologies. When he spoke of the moral collapse of John Howard Yoder, his teacher and theological hero, Schenck's tone carried grief, not defense. He said, you can't pretend Yoder's influence isn't there. He said, but it's not enough to just add an asterisk. Brilliant theology for Dr. Schenck does not get a free pass from moral failure. In that moment, Schenck was doing missiology. He was still doing missiology, still evangelizing the West, teaching us to tell the truth about ourselves. What if confession were not an embarrassment to mission, but its beginning? Schenck believed that the Spirit leads us not around failure, but through it, turning wounds into classrooms, guilt into discernment, and confession into formation. Another current that ran through the interviews was, I coded it as confronting power, and it so often traced back to the life and work of Charles and Marguerite Kraft. Few figures have persistently challenged the habits of control that accompany mission sometimes. From their earliest years in Nigeria, the Crafts resisted the colonial logic that silenced local voices and regulated what counted as Christian, even down to whether congregations could drum or dance in their services. And their protest, the Crafts' protest, was simple and still radical. Domination has no place in the gospel. And their courage, that courage that they had, it came at a cost. Evangelicals on the right dismissed him as a relativist, and progressives faulted him for holding too tightly to Revelation. But from that contested middle space emerged insights that continue to shape the field. Christianity and Culture, one of his major works, it was initially rejected by evangelical publishers before Orbis decided to take the risk. It became a landmark in missiological discourse. He likes to say, and I heard him say this on a number of occasions, including on the podcast, I'm not an academic. Academics is what I do, not who I am. And that kind of humility shaped everything. From sitting on mats in Nigerian villages to refusing to preach when others could. For Kraft, theology was always cultural, always provisional. As he liked to say, you don't do theology without heresy. Theology must risk error to stay alive. Later, Charles would unsettle Western theology on another front, insisting that the spiritual realm could not be dismissed as superstition. His theology of power encounter pressed mission beyond paternalism and rationalism alike, insisting that the gospel confronts domination, whether that's human or spiritual. And it confronts it with trust in the power of the living God. This very controversial pivot toward healing and spiritual power evidenced I believe, as I read through his transcript again and again, it evidenced a willingness to be redirected and corrected by the Spirit of God. The Crafts' legacy, read through this lens, is not about right theory, but right posture, unlearning habits of dominance, and trusting the Spirit's disruption. Daniel White Hodge, professor of intercultural communications at North Park University in Chicago and founder of the Profound Faith podcast, presses the conversation on power into the terrain of race and epistemic authority. He's actually our most recently published podcast. And his interview exposes a wound, a gaping wound in our tradition. Missiology has rarely been at its best when engaging the experiences of Black women and men in this country. Whose experience counts as intercultural, and who gets to decide? When an admissions officer once told him that he lacked cross-cultural experience, that he needed 6 years of before he could apply, he replied, "I've been a Black man in America since the day that I was born. That's cross-cultural enough." And that line exposes a wound that our field still carries. Hodge, through hip-hop theology and Afro-pessimism, that critique, he reclaims lament and rage, and even rage, as theological acts, forms of truth-telling through which the Spirit groans. He says, Tupac's lyrics carried gospel truth long before the church recognized it. A reminder that revelation does not wait for permission from white institutions, or predominantly white institutions. He insists that theology must sound like the streets it claims to serve. And yet Daniel names pain, and he does it without despair. He honors his mentors like Jude Tiersma Watson and Roberta King, even as he names the pain of being pushed to the margins of the guild that he himself sought to serve. And he stays in the room, not for comfort, but conviction. His voice is both a critique and a gift, a painful reminder of what we have ignored, and an invitation to reimagine mission from the underside of power, where the Spirit of God has been speaking all along. Across the narratives, this pattern holds true. Missiology's future depends on its courage to tell the truth about its past. Power imbalances, they're not going to go away, but humility, not triumphalism, will carry the field forward to a new generation. So what if confession became our method? What if lament were recognized as scholarship and repentance as pedagogy? Schenck and Kraft and Hodge and many others bear witness that when missiology faces its history truthfully, even its scars can teach. Wounds become more than memories of failure. They become classrooms of the Spirit. So if this theme is about naming the wounds of power, this last theme asks this question, and this is the last theme that I'll share with you. What kind of leaders can resist repeating them? Because the challenge of missiology is not just, it's as pedagogical as it is theological. How do we form leaders who refuse to hoard the chalk and learn instead to listen for the Spirit's quiet whisper? Missiology at its best is a laboratory for learning how to teach without gripping the chalk, how to lead with conviction but not control. I quoted these pedagogies of humble power, and few stories captured this better than Johnny Ramirez Johnson's story and interview, who builds listening into his pedagogy. His students, he tells them, must interview someone that they would normally ignore. He tells the story of how one of his students chose a quiet Guatemalan man who slipped in and out of church unnoticed, or tried to slip in and out unnoticed. And the conversation, he describes, changed them both, Johnny Ramirez Johnson's student and this man. The man eventually left gang life, returned to Guatemala, and became a missionary. And the student, Johnny's student, discovered that listening is itself a missional act. But Johnny also tells the story of his own failure, how years ago when an Ethiopian neighbor invited him for coffee, he declined. It was a terrible failure, he says in his interview. I continually tell my angel, I'm so sorry I did not hear your voice. He even jokes now that he drinks coffee as repentance. Both stories echo Acts 10, Peter and pork, doctrine and neighbor. I guess part of the background here is that Ramirez Johnson is Seventh-day Adventist. Peter and pork, doctrine and neighbor, and these stories, they expose what Ramirez Johnson calls the devil's greatest lie, relativism. Truth matters, he insists, but love requires that we keep discovering how God is already speaking through the other. At a global gathering, drafting the WCCs Together Towards Life, Christine Kim noticed that she was the only native English speaker in the room, and so she volunteered to help write. She tells the story about how she didn't walk into the room wanting to lead. It was an act of service. It was an act of linguistic service that placed her at the center of a 3-person editing team. an evangelical, Dr. Kim, a Syrian Orthodox theologian, and the WCC director. Negotiating how to name Christ faithfully and inclusively. And she highlights an uncomfortable truth that relatively few theologians publishing in our field are from the majority world, and fewer still are women. It's a privilege to even be in the room, she says at one point. Her story exposes the layers of power in our field. Some can choose to step back, others are never invited in. Daniel White Hodge explains, this absence is not accidental. Absences are designed. Who frames the question? Who curates the voices? Who decides what counts as excellence? A pedagogy of humble power must begin upstream in the systems that decide who gets to lead, who gets to learn. Dr. Hodge, in his interview, there were other interviews, but they expose how Black scholars, how women, younger majority world voices are often, and others, those with disabilities, we talked about those in the trenches this morning, their voices, they are often never offered the chalk at all. And the answer is not token inclusion, but structural imagination, the courage to redesign classrooms and conferences and canons so that new voices can shape the curriculum. Across the interviews, this was the shared pattern. These themes I'm sharing, they're not conclusions, they're more of confessions, provisional glimpses of what becomes visible when the Spirit leads and our analysis follows. Missiology's best, I admit, is never self-evident. Lament and anger, silence, resistance, these too are often ways, not just appreciation, these too can also be ways that the Spirit tells truth. Curation is power. The fact that we have this platform, thanks to Galen Van Reenen, to do this podcast is a form of power. And we all have biases. A podcast, a lecture, a syllabus, all of these decide who gets to be remembered. And if we aren't attentive, we can easily favor what feels familiar or non-threatening to those with power. But naming this bias is not the same as repairing it. The future of missiology, I pose, will depend less on guarding continuity and more on discerning together across difference. This discipline, born as it is at the crossroads, fluent in translation, practiced in listening, is uniquely suited to this task. It must keep widening the circle. Majority world voices, women's voices, grassroots, younger voices, voices that are of disabled peoples. Oral and multilingual wisdom beside written scholarship. And again, real dialogue doesn't just diversify the guest list, it creates space to rewrite the script. If the Spirit can still surprise us, then we're still doing missiology. Perhaps surprise is the surest sign that we're still paying attention. At its best, missiology is not the study of mission, but the shared practice of attending to the God who moves before us. We are not cartographers of the kingdom, but witnesses to its approach. The Spirit runs the show, and our task is to keep yielding the chalk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Martin, for this paper. I have some more formal remarks of thanks to offer, but before I do, just wanted to speak to my kind of uncanny sensation of having myself now listen to many hours of your voice. And so here we are in the same space for the first time, and yours is already a very familiar voice to me. And I say that in token of thanks for all your work and Greg's work on the podcast. It really is such just a marvelous and a unique resource. So thank you for your light work on the podcast for these years that you've been contributing to it and leading it. And thanks so much as well for this paper, which really, to me, in an impressive way, distills and crystallizes and encapsulates so much of that archival work that you all have put together. So really, my thanks to you. And it's rich fodder in today's lineup of speakers, and rich fodder for us as we consider missiology in the next generation. By the way, I can't see myself, so I'm hoping that I'm up on the screen and all that is working well technically. Somebody can just reassure in the chat. Be grateful. So besides just thanking you for this work, Martin, and just articulating my recognition and gratitude for your voice, I have three maybe areas of questions that I want to pose to you on the basis of your paper today. But as I considered these questions, they really boil down, I think, to one more overarching consideration. And that overarching consideration is this: who, humanly speaking, practices mission? Who, humanly speaking, practices or participates in mission? That's my overarching question that informs three smaller, more focused, distinct question areas that have to do with archive, so archival questions, theological questions, and then lastly, pedagogical questions. And before I engage those individually, that larger question about who practices, who participates in mission, humanly speaking or creaturely speaking, really feels to me fitting in the arc of today's lectures. I'd want to preempt the plenary following, but just to notice the way in which sometimes even today we've talked about mission in terms of the Spirit's work, perichoresis between the triune, the members of the triune God, God's invitation given to all creatures to join in that perichoretic dance. So I can imagine with that sort of grand vision in mind, the ways that practitioners of mission involve kind of several nested participants. Some who are professionals, members of our various particular guild, teachers, educators, pedagogues, folks who are kind of quote unquote in the field, who are in some ways working interculturally in sort of testifying, witnessing to the Spirit's work in one form or another. But also churches are mentioned in the paper itself. Leaders comes up towards the end. And then I'm uncertain myself how directly to take the pedagogical and educative and classroom vocabulary in the paper as well, which rings more true to sort of teaching context, even in undergraduate context. Like I say, all these are sort of nested together and one impacts another. But I would just want to hold that overarching question about who is it who practices mission conceivably if the invitation from the Spirit is addressed to the entirety of creation, then even non-human creatures could participate in mission, I suppose. So that's my grand question: who, humanly speaking, creaturely speaking, contributes to mission? But one more specific questions, and I raise these really as open-ended questions to you, and hopefully maybe will inform the questions we receive from folks in the room or online. They're questions, not critiques. First has to do with the archive. The podcast, as you said, it forms the archive out of which you generated a paper and coded several different responses. And again, I was very impressed by that kind of analytical operation, that apparatus, and found even some of the terminology that you used in the paper just really generative. I don't think you mentioned it in the spoken remarks now, but architectures of absence, for instance, is just a phrase that's going to live with me. Translational stewardship, rage as witness, these phrases that you entered into your analysis of the archive are really just really poignant and provocative. Anyways, but the archive is the podcast. And so I wondered what happens to some of the considerations of mission if our archive is somehow kind of expanded outwards, as I believe you wish to do at the end of the paper. How might the questions change if we answer that the practitioners, the participants, the contributors of mission are not just leaders, recognized, sort of brand name, if you will, leaders in the field of missiology, but kind of larger networks, churches, denominations, and even beyond the human, like I said. So archival questions, I'd be curious to sort of hear you riff on that. Secondly, theological questions. The first theme that you identified is the primacy of the spirit, the sort of pneumatology, the third sort of movement that Dr. Kim mentions. And so my theological question has to do with the way that in the history of reflection on mission, our movement towards God, sort of the theocentricity of mission, initially in the Missio Dei conversations at mid-century, perhaps even in some way too, the move towards ecology in mission discourse, are really, really sort of equal and opposite to the practices of confession and recognitions of failures and complicity and colonialism in the history of mission. And those aren't just sort of separate tracks, but are really very much entangled together and mutually implicated. And so I wanted to sort of I would love to hear you speak more about how that's those theological questions about the Spirit's work of renewing the earth, how and in what ways those are reflected in, refracted in, how those are imbricated in the sort of recognitions of failure and unsettledness and confession and rage that characterize some of the latter parts, the latter themes of the paper. So that's my theological. I had an archival question. That's a theological question. And then lastly, and in closing, a pedagogical question. I loved Wounds as classrooms of the Spirit, again, with sort of analytical, this coding that you gave to the interviews. But again, pedagogical, it just made me wonder who is teaching whom exactly, and how much directly did you mean classroom spaces? You spoke about the contraction of higher education in the U.S. And maybe church decline as well. But who's exactly? How much should I be imagining? Teachers in a church context, in an academic context, and or what happens when I sort of expand the aperture of pedagogy? And maybe that's what you intended. If so, I'm very interested in that. In terms of who is teaching whom, who is transmitting kind of understandings, perspectives, insights from the Spirit to learners at large. And especially that's relevant given our theme of the whole conference, being missiology in the next generation. And of course, you've done us a real service in examining the legacy of these leading mission thinkers. But as we look towards and imagine missiology for the next generation, who might the teachers be beyond them? I would, again, love to hear you riff on that. I think I'll close it down there. I'm mindful of the time, but once again, my thanks to you and to Greg as well for your work on the podcast. I love it, and my thanks as well for this really insightful paper.
So, 3 questions. The archival question. I think Greg and I were and remain very attentive to the fact that by choosing certain voices, we're not choosing other voices, and we are concerned by the way that, and it, just reflexively, we've noted how we unintentionally replicate the same kind of Western centrism that we are criticizing. So there's a sense in which we, by interviewing certain people, re-establish that kind of that center of gravity, or we imply that the center of gravity of missiology is the West, right? And it is institutions like Fuller. And that's something that we're attentive to, and we definitely are talking about ways to, we don't want that to be the extent of missiology, right? It has to be a lot bigger than that. The archive has to be larger. It has to involve, as Collin, you were sharing, it has to involve churches. It has to involve so many other voices. And then how do we do that, right? How do we shift the questions in order to make that work? Because the questions very much are designed, these appreciative questions are designed for professors, right? They're designed for people that have published within missiology. And again, we're very aware of how ironic it is almost, right? That we're saying, hey, we need to break these things down, but then we continue to reinforce it just by virtue of whose voices are not there. So the second question had to do with a question of, that was the question of, is that classrooms, or was that the
Third one, but take it in whatever order you please.
was the second? Oh, theology. The second one was theology, right? It was about, okay, so tell me the second question again. How would you rephrase it? Because I want to make sure that
I think I loved both the kind of, they're not quite halves, but the first, the sort of new missiological lead of the paper, primacy of the spirit, and then I also love the second half, all these experiences of your interviewees with failure, with unsettledness, with critique, with rage, kind of and so I wanted to hear you sort of reflect on how those. How are those kind of even more deeply consonant or related, or how does pneumatology help us to pull all those together?
it's a really good question. The Spirit of God is at work, and maybe one of the things that pulls this together is, well, I think there are some assumptions that are, behind, and you heard them. I shared many of the assumptions in the paper. There are some assumptions that we have, and one of them is that we want missiology in a new generation to emphasize certain things, and emphasize like new things, perhaps, things that perhaps were not emphasized as much in the past. And one of them is that discernment of God's agency piece. So, that attentiveness to the Spirit of God at work in classrooms, in neighborhoods, in families, in our conversations with neighbors, the Spirit of God at work in even our broader conversations about scholarship. And that pneumatology, we want that to take center stage. And I think this will also be, some of what we talk about in our panels later on today. And you're right that so many of these questions are questions that I think they are at the heart of this whole 60th anniversary, right? What does this? Let's talk about theology. What's the theology that's going to guide us over the next 60 years, right? What kind of theology is the kind of theology that our institutions need, our churches need, our leadership training needs? So I'm going to leave it there for right now, because I think we'll have other opportunities to answer. The last question then was the question of pedagogy and the question of like classrooms. We do imagine, I certainly imagine that when it comes to discerning the Spirit, that is something that we see as important for people to teach in classrooms, people to do in that kind of discernment is important for Christian communities to do together. And it's the kind of discernment that we do even individually. So classrooms, yes. Neighborhoods, yes. Churches, absolutely. And for those of us who are missiologists, I think of us as the people who are thinking deeply about what that discernment looks like, especially in intercultural communities, right? How do we do that well in a way that doesn't silence certain voices, in a way that doesn't steamroll, in a way that isn't inattentive to power? How do we do this in a way that is bringing in all of these different resources like anthropology, in a way that brings in sociology and all the sociological tools that we have, in a way that brings in culture studies, in a way that brings in theology and systematic theology, and what we're learning about church practice, and those come to be a part of these conversations of discernment, of discerning the Spirit among us. Where is it, God, that you're at work so that we can join with what you're doing?
I'm struck by how much of the answers you're offering and even how much of the paper depends upon that communal discernment of the Spirit. And what we want, and even what I'm seeing in some of these questions that I've received, are like asking for practical, 1, 2, 3 steps for how we do that.
Okay.
And yet, part of the nature of the task is that we should be surprised by the Spirit. So, can you offer any kind of guidelines for how to balance these various things that you've identified? Can you go any further into that, or is this the place where you just say, I guess we need to wait on God to tell us what to do?
No, absolutely not. I think that is, I think that's part of the discernment piece, right? In part of what we do is missiology. I think missiology at its best over the next 60 years, I hope, is the study of how we do discernment as well, right? So let's gather as intercultural teams and as scholars. Let's gather as communities and discern what discernment looks like, right? So how are we going to do this? How are we going to discern the Spirit? Now, to back up, there is another answer to this question. I am a practical theologian as much as I am a missiologist, and within practical theology, there's a method. The method that I have learned through Mark Lau Branson is a 5-step method referred to as the praxis cycle. And it is a cycle, right? So this isn't just a one-time you learn it. These are processes of discernment, right? This is an ongoing, that is, mission involves this ongoing process of naming where we're at, what is current praxis, of bringing in cultural resources, of looking at scripture, looking at the story of God that's been revealed in the Bible, and then also telling stories, and then experimenting. So taking all of those resources and coming up with experiments, things that we try, that we gain a capacity for improvisation through that work, and then that sparks new cycles of discernment, of figuring out what's going on. So there's not just one praxis cycle. There are many ways that we could go about this. That's one that I know and that I love, that I think is very, very helpful and useful for churches even. I use it in my classrooms. I use it in my congregation as well.
Collin, with 1 minute left, do you want to offer any further comments? Because, you asked the questions, but I wonder if you also were perceiving some answers as you were framing the questions.
Just saying in 1 minute that I was really helpfully provoked by some of the conversations earlier in the day that invited and encouraged me to expand my vision of what the Spirit is doing and whom the Spirit is involving in the work of God's mission. And so I don't have a clear sort of answer about who might be the teachers, how far might the archive expand, but I'm interested to think about that in a really sort of dramatically wide scope way. yes, to include many of the marginalized kind of human voices that have been missing from the conversation. That came through loud and clear in the paper and is going to linger with me. So thanks again for that. But also even other actors who are left out and haven't yet been flagged. So no answers from me, but I'm really grateful for the questions.
All right. I think for purposes of time, we need to put a pause on that. And then we're actually going to transition in like maybe 5 minutes or so into a full panel discussion with each of the presenters and respondents for the day and try to see if we can do a wrap up to see what it is that we've learned today. So if you want to take 5 minutes, run to the restroom, and be back at, well, 4:40 by my watch. So I'll see you back here soon.